I greet you this morning, especially the young people who are both here in the conference center and throughout the world. Yours is a chosen generation of destiny, and like Elder Holland, I speak especially to you. Many years ago, while visiting our family in Florida, a tornado touched down not too far from us. It was not nearly as severe as Elder Rasband's experience. One woman living in a mobile home went into her bathroom for safety. The mobile home began to shake. A few moments passed. Then she heard her neighbor's voice. "I am here in the front room." Coming out of the bathroom, to her great astonishment, she discovered that the tornado had lifted and carried her mobile home through the air, landing it perfectly upright on the top of her neighbor's mobile home. More concerning than the prophesied earthquakes and wars are the spiritual whirlwinds that can uproot you from your spiritual foundations and land your spirit in places you never imagined possible, sometimes without your hardly noticing that you have been moved.
Later, as I was about to graduate from the university, I fell in love with a beautiful young woman named Janine Watkins. I thought she was beginning to have some deep feelings for me also. One night, when we were talking about the future, she carefully wove into the discussion a statement that changed my life forever. She said, "When I marry, it will be to a faithful, returned missionary in the temple." I hadn't thought much about a mission before then. That night, my motivation to consider a mission service changed dramatically. I went home and I could think of nothing else. I was awake all night long. I was completely distracted from my studies the next day. After many prayers, I made the decision to meet with my bishop and begin my missionary application.
41 years ago, I climbed into the driver's seat of an 18-wheel semi-truck with my beautiful wife, Jan, and our infant son, Scotty. We were taking a heavy load of construction materials across several states. In those days, there were no seatbelt restrictions or infant car seats. My wife held our precious son in her arms. Her comment, "We sure are high off the ground," should have given me a clue about her feelings of apprehension. As we made our descent over historic Donner Pass, a steep section of highway, the cab of the semi suddenly and unexpectedly filled with smoke, very thick smoke. It was difficult to see and we could hardly breathe. With a heavy rig, brakes alone are not enough to rapidly decrease speed. So using the engine brakes and gearing down, I frantically attempted to stop. Just as I was pulling to the side of the road, but before we had come to a full stop, my wife opened the door of the cab and jumped out with our baby in her arms. I watched helplessly as they tumbled in the dirt. As soon as I had the semi stopped, I bolted from the smoking cab. With adrenaline pumping, I ran through the rocks and weeds and held them in my arms. Jan's forearms and elbows were battered and bleeding, but thankfully, she and our son were both breathing. I just held them close as the dust settled on the side of the highway. As my heartbeat normalized and I caught my breath, I blurted out, "What in the world were you thinking? Do you know how dangerous that was? You could have been killed." She looked back at me with tears running down her smoke-smudged cheeks and said something that pierced my heart and still rings in my ears. "I was just trying to save our son." I realized in that moment She thought the engine was on fire, fearing the truck would explode and we would die. I, however, knew it was an electrical failure, hazardous, but not fatal. I looked at my precious wife, softly rubbing the head of our infant son, Scotty, and wondered, what kind of woman would do something so courageous and utterly irrational?
Several years ago, President Monson and I were offered an opportunity to tour Air Force One, the magnificent aircraft that transports the President of the United States. There were painstaking security checks by the Secret Service, and I somehow smiled a little as agents searched our dear prophet prior to boarding. Then the pilot in command invited me to take the captain's seat. It was a remarkable experience to again sit at the helm of a wonderful flying machine like the kind I had flown for so many years. Memories of flights across oceans and continents filled my heart and mind. I envisioned exciting takeoffs and landings at airports all over the world. Almost unconsciously, I placed my hands on the four throttles of the 747. Just then, a beloved and unmistakable voice came from behind, the voice of Thomas S. Monson. "Dieter," he said, "don't even think about it." I'm not admitting to anything, but it just may be that President Monson read my mind. When we're tempted to do things we should not do, brethren, please let us listen to the loving warning of trusted family, friends, our beloved prophet, and of course, always the Savior. There's an old story of a waiter who asked a customer whether he had enjoyed the meal. The guest replied that everything was fine, but it would have been better if they had served more bread. The next day, when the man returned, the waiter doubled the amount of bread, giving him 4 slices instead of 2, but still, the man was not happy. The next day, the waiter doubled the bread again without success. On the 4th day, the waiter was really determined to make the man happy. And so he took a 9-foot-long loaf of bread, cut it in half, and with a smile served that to the customer. The waiter could scarcely wait for the man's reaction. After the meal, the man looked up and said, "Good, as always. But I see you're back to giving only 2 slices of bread." My dear brothers and sisters, the choice is ours. We can choose to limit our gratitude based on the blessings we feel we lack. Or we can choose to be like Nephi, whose grateful heart never faltered.
64 years ago this September, I returned home from my mission in England. 3 days after returning, I attended a Hello Day dance at the University of Utah with a friend of mine. He told me about a beautiful sophomore named Barbara Bowen, who he thought I ought to meet. He brought her over and introduced us, and we started to dance. Unfortunately, this was what we used to call a tag dance, which meant that you only got to dance with the girl until somebody else tagged you out. Barbara was vivacious and popular, so I only got to dance with her for less than a minute before another young man tagged me out. That was just not acceptable to me. Having learned the importance of follow-up on my mission, I got her telephone number and called her the very next day to ask her out. But she was busy with school and social commitments. Thankfully, my mission taught me to be persistent, even in the face of discouragement. And I was eventually able to make a date, and that date led to others. Somehow, during those dates, I was able to convince her that I was the only true and living returned missionary, at least as far as she should be concerned. Now, 64 years later, there are 7 children, many grandchildren and great-grandchildren, who stand as evidence of the significant truth that no matter how good your message is, you may not get a chance to deliver it without consistent, persistent follow-up.
I have a dear friend who, in the early years of his marriage, was convinced he and his family needed a 4-wheel drive pickup truck. His wife was sure that he did not need, but merely wanted the new vehicle. A playful conversation between this husband and wife initiated their consideration of the advantages and disadvantages of such a purchase. "Sweetheart, we need a 4-wheel drive truck." She asked, "Why do you think we need a new truck?" He answered her question with what he believed was the perfect response. "What if we needed milk for our children in a terrible storm? And the only way I could get to the grocery store was in a pickup." His wife replied with a smile, "If we buy a new truck, we won't have money for milk."